Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just following on from the remarks made earlier, there's a mantra growing in Africa now that farming is cool. So I think we start off with that this morning. My name is Julie Gichuru. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I am the TV host of the Africa Leadership Dialogues and the founder of ARIMUS Media Limited. I'm based in East Africa and really happy to see all these faces here this morning. We have an incredible...
I was going to introduce you and say great things about you, but...
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry.
Please read her bio. Julie is just a great TV host, entrepreneur, and brings us so much expertise, and I look forward to her moderation of the program. And I want to thank Congressman Jeff Fortenberry as well for his inspiring remarks. And I know that the visits to places like Honduras certainly do have an impact on forming the views of members of Congress, just as my trip back in the 80s helped me think about the creation of the Farmer to Farmer program when I visited El Salvador and Guatemala. Julie, it's all yours. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
And after they complete their discussion, then Lisa Moon will lead the moderation for question and answers from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was fast mover advantage I was seeking there. So we have an incredible panel with us this morning. Really happy to host CD Glin, who is the Associate Director of the Africa Region, Rockefeller Foundation. He's right next to me. And next to CD, we have Mark Hyman, who's the MD and the Chairman of the Institute for Functional Medicine. He's a Director at the Cleveland Clinic Center for Functional Medicine, the founder and Medical Director of the UltraWellness Center, and a medical editor with the Huffington Post. Next to him is Lindiwe Sibanda. She's the CEO of the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network. She's based in Pretoria, South Africa. And right at the end, we have with us Patrick Webb. And Patrick is the McFarland Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. That's at Tufts University. He's a policy and evidence advisor on the Global Panel on Agriculture, Food Systems and Nutrition. And he's a director with USAID's Feed the Future Nutrition Innovation Lab Asia. So what an incredible panel. Thank you so much for making time to be with us this morning. I think, Patrick, I'm going to start with you this morning. And a very basic question. How would you characterize the global malnutrition challenge, and what are its human and its economic costs?
A weighty question to begin with. First, I think agriculture is cool. How many of you would agree with that? All right. I think we already have a bolus of support here for enhancing agriculture. We can't accept it as it is. Malnutrition is both. It's not just undernutrition, it includes the obesity, the overweight, the micronutrient deficiencies that are plaguing the entire world. There isn't a country in the world that does not have some aspect of a malnutrition problem. So this is a global issue and we need global action. But let me focus on the undernutrition. There's about, you've already had lots of numbers, but there's about 200 million undernourished children in the world, stunted and wasted, too short, too thin. But that's just a number, right? So let me reframe that. That's something like, roughly, every single child in the United States, from Washington to Washington State, being malnourished, every single one of them times 10. That's the scale of the problem that we're dealing with globally. Fortunately, not many of those are in the States, but some of them are. Now, this matters partly because malnutrition kills. We already heard that it's contributing roughly 50% of preventable child deaths globally, but it also impairs productivity. It stops people being able to fulfill their potential. And I'll end with just two points. One, there's lots of empirical research that shows that not being stunted, which means growing to your full potential height, in Brazil, every 1 centimeter additional height in the final attained height of an adult adds about 2.5% to lifetime earnings of that individual. So 1 centimeter growth in total height adds 2.5 times more, 2.5% more earnings. Not because you're tall, but because you're healthier, your ability to interact socially, your cognitive facilities are all improved. And the other example is schooling, which you can't be sick and you can't be undernourished to do well in school. And across developing countries, every additional grade of schooling completed in developing countries is associated with a 10% increase in incomes in the lifetimes to come. Mm-hmm. So it matters economically, it matters for the individual, and it matters for society.
Thank you for putting context to the numbers. It's shocking. And I think, Mark, I'll come to you next. It seems like a very obvious question, but how does the food we eat impact on our health? What are we getting wrong? How do we change this situation?
Well, you mentioned that chronic disease is a huge problem. And I wonder how many doctors are here. Am I the only doctor? Yeah, I'm the only doctor.
There's one over there.
Yeah. Oh, we have one. Fantastic. Well, I think the missing link here is that food is both the cause and the cure for most chronic disease, as well as obviously malnutrition. Both have to be addressed, but the scope of the problem is staggering and I think underappreciated globally, because over the last 30 or 40 years there's been a juggernaut of obesity and diabetes and chronic disease across the world that has outpaced our focus on dealing with it. And our global resources that have been spent on dealing with this are a fraction of those that are spent on infectious disease and malnutrition. And yet now we are facing over the next, by the end of the next decade, $47 trillion we're going to spend on lifestyle preventable, mostly food-caused chronic disease like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. We now know that in this country, 84% of our healthcare costs are driven by chronic disease, which is $3.8 trillion of 84% of that. We know that we have a problem globally where now we have almost 2.5 times as many people who go to bed overweight as go to bed hungry. It's 2.1 billion people. By 2050, half of the world will be overweight unless we do something differently. And the human capital costs and the nature's capital that are being depleted by the way we grow, produce, distribute, and consume food are enormous, and they're really things that have to be grappled with at a global level because everybody is affected. And like you said, children are increasingly affected in this country. When I went to medical school, there was not a single child who had type 2 diabetes that I saw. Now it's 1 in 4 children have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. In Mexico, it's 1 in 10 kids who have what we call adult onset diabetes. And this is a sort of a disease of actually being overfed and undernourished. We often find this coexistence of obesity and malnutrition together. And the reason is that food is not just calories. And I think this is a sort of an emerging set of scientific discoveries that food is not just about energy, which is necessary to prevent malnutrition, but it's also information. And the way it communicates to your body signals of health and disease is being worked out in a very intricate way. So we now know that the food you eat, the quality of the food you eat determines which genes are turned on or off, which hormones are regulated or increased or decreased, how proteins are expressed, and what microbiome you create that promotes health or disease, how your immune system is regulated. And all these things are affected by the role of food as not just calories or energy, but information. So we've focused for a long time on sufficiency of calories, which is necessary for global food production. But we also sort of have missed this whole idea that it's not just the quantity, it's the quality of the food. And I think this is something we have to grapple with. And I hope together we can kind of collectively rethink our approach to the types of food we're producing and consuming. In fact, it's our calorie-poor, calorie-dense, nutrient-poor, high-sugar processed food diet that's driving this. Effectively, we have created one of the worst diets on the planet and are exporting it to the rest of the world. And China now is number 1 and India is number 2 in type 2 diabetes in terms of volume. So this problem is global, and 80% of the world's type 2 diabetics are in the developing world. So we think this is a first world problem, but 90% of the deaths that occur before the age of 60 from chronic disease, 90% occur in low and middle income countries. So this is a problem facing not just the developed world, but everybody, and I think we have to grapple with the quality of the food we produce, not just the quantity.
Thank you for that. And I saw there was a couple of more doctors here in the audience. We'll be going back to more discussion on that. Lindiwe, it's a tragic fact that half the people, more than half the people who are chronically hungry are farming families. They're living in farming families. It's a tragedy. The question is, how can we improve the nutrition for these families?
I'm glad you're talking about smallholder farming, because I am a product of smallholder farming. And I think smallholder agriculture is cool. It's a tragedy and it's sad, and we have to give dignity to the smallholder farmers. And I'll talk in the context of Africa, where I come from. And I'd like to bring to this room a powerful woman who touched many lives, including my own life, and that's my own grandmother. She farmed in a small village in Zimbabwe on 1 acre, and we provided the labor. My parents were very smart in that we went to school in the city, but every weekend, without fail, we would visit Grandma, and that was to provide labor. And at the end of every school holiday, we would have spent 30 days with Grandma, and total 100 days per year spent in the village, and just 230 days in the city. And what did this mean? It meant we grew our own food, we processed it at the farm, we stored it on farm and consumed it, and not only fed us in the village, but also took some. And what were we growing? In that 1 acre plot, my grandmother would produce her maize patch, she would have a vegetable patch, she would have a millet patch, because we liked sweet sorghum as well, so there would be that. She will have sweet potatoes on one side and some cassava. And she would also have some beans that we would have with part of our traditional staple, which is maize meal. But she would also produce cattle. We had 2 dairy cows and goats. And every time we came for the weekend, it would be a chicken that is slaughtered from a backyard. For the school holidays, it would be a whole goat, and it would be dried up, and we take the meat with us to town. All that has changed. When we visit the village, we have to take food to feed my cousins who remain on the farm. And this is because they only produce enough to supply 2 months of their needs. And the rest, they have to rely on remittances. Now, this begs the question, what has changed? I must give credit to the medical fraternity, because you've been smart. You've gone for nutrition interventions directly, and yet we in agriculture have not enhanced nutrition-sensitive approaches that complement what you've done. You've done breastfeeding campaigns, and I can talk to that as a mother who breastfed 3 big boys. And yet, on agriculture, we always ask, what can agriculture do for nutrition? We're always the first to say it's a given, it happens. But we have not articulated the how. We know there are 5 potential pathways. It's what my grandmother did, production on farm. But there's also the income stream. There's also the increased productivity that then allows the economy to boom, because agriculture in most African countries is up to 40% in some of the GDP. And also there's just the nutrition-sensitive agriculture that can then enhance the availability of good foods that are nutrient-dense. But we have not harnessed those opportunities. Malnutrition is a wicked problem that will require all of us. It will require transdisciplinary approaches so that together we can solve this problem. Let me also talk about one specific intervention that is critical, and that's women empowerment. In Africa, 80% of the food that we eat goes through the hands of a woman, either through production, processing, storage, utilization, or feeding the family. This is the backbone of the family, and yet we've done very little to empower women. And yet this is one of the powerful interventions that can bring to bear what agriculture can do for nutrition and family health. When we look at the statistics, if you give women, part of the improvement actually in reduced stunting between the 70s and 90s, 50% of that came as a reduction of empowerment of women. If you give women more land, 30% more land than men, you find that we can reduce hunger by up to 17%. incredible achievements if only we could trigger the liver of women. But we have not known how to do it. And my appeal would be for the agriculture community to get more investments, to go back to the drawing board. We need to research. There are questions that we have not been able to answer. We do not have the metrics for designing interventions that have a win-win for yield and for quality. The Green Revolution has emphasized quantity, but we now need a rainbow revolution that brings the milk, the eggs, the meat, and the cereals, and all the grains, and the legumes, and the tubers that will produce children that are healthy. And if we believe in people and investing in people, this is the time to do it. Agriculture can do it, but we need the metrics, and it will require investment in research. It will require our universities globally to partner with the health community, but to go back to say agriculture, we can't wait for stunting. Can we design metrics that will allow us to know what we're doing right and how to design projects that yield for nutrition?
Thank you so much for that, Lindiwe, and sharing your personal experience and story with us. I think it really enriches the conversation we're having this morning. CD, I come to you now, and we heard the figures earlier this morning, 40 to 50% of fruits and vegetables going to waste. I think 30% of grains. It's shocking considering, the situation that the world is in. So, what's driving these high rates of food wastage? And look, what are the interventions? What are the simple steps we can take to start to change this?
Julie, when we hear those numbers, I think we do hear them, but I don't know that we really feel them.
Understand them, right?
Understand them. The poorest people on the planet, the most malnutritious people on the planet, produce the food that we throw away every day, the food that you threw away at breakfast, that we left on our plates. And that's shocking. And I think when we hear that 1/3 number of everything that's produced is lost. Lindiwe, you mentioned the Green Revolution. As a proud member of the Rockefeller Foundation, part of our unfinished business of the Green Revolution is this reduction in food waste and food spoilage. And really sort of saying that at the individual level, there are things that are driving waste in terms of the intentionality, what we do in our households, when we see sell-by dates that turn into throwaway dates, when we don't eat all the food on our plate, when we don't have food banks and food parks, the individual behavior change that can happen in developing countries can really reduce food waste. And then there's the food systems aspects, the things that happen on farm, that happen with lack of proper practices, that happen with lack of storage, processing capability, distribution, the food systems aspects, which is driving loss. And we've come to the conclusion that if we look at the reduction of food waste, we answer some critical questions in society. We've all been to a conference in the past year or two on how to feed 9 billion by 2050. And there is a way that people are talking about improving yields and growing our way out of the problem. And we have an investment in that side of the equation as well. But if we're talking about increasing productivity, putting more production in this bucket, but the bucket has 30 to 50% holes in it, that's irresponsible, not only for ourselves, not only for people, not only for the planet, but even for profit and profitability. We really need to look at this in a holistic way. And we're really asking ourselves at the foundation how to improve society with the resources that we have. And that's where this food waste and food loss and food spoilage issues become really central. And we look at it as a triple bottom line opportunity. Not only what can we do, but what impact would it have? It's sort of a gateway solution. If you reduce food waste and food storage, what do? Well, you preserve the natural resources, the scarce natural resources that exist. There's no more land that's becoming available. There's lessened water that's coming available. When we waste food, we waste the inputs, the land, the water, the improved seeds, all of the great innovations that are happening in agriculture go to waste with that. So there's a ecosystem, the natural ecosystems opportunity here. And then we talk about it from a profitability standpoint, in that people literally work from can't see in the morning, from the darkness of the morning to the darkness of the night to produce. And the reality is that, again, that 1/3 is lost. And so if we can increase that supply, if we can save more of what they have, then we're talking about increasing incomes. And with increased incomes, here comes increased choices. So you can buy more nutritious food. You can change your eating habits, because now you have the money to do something about it. And then ultimately, the increasing of food availability really impacts the health and the food and nutritional security. So it's interesting that what Mark said is around the fact that calories, so greater supply of cereals and grains, but perishables. Fruits and vegetables are called perishable because they perish fast. And the reality is, if we save them, then we can make not only more food available, more calories available, but more nutritious food available. So we look at this food waste, food loss issue as a triple bottom line, and we see a limited awareness. Don't just hear the numbers, feel them, understand them. Let's do something about them at the individual level. And then from the food system level, let's really talk about shortening the supply chain of where food is produced, how it's transported, and where it's processed. And that's where we think there's some real solutions, and we're proud to be a part of this movement, because we do think increasing the awareness at the individual level, increasing the awareness at the food system level will really bring about change and will really help us solve these problems of how to improve society with the resources that we have.
Thanks for that. And, we'd love to hear if you have any experiences of things interventions that have worked. Please do share them with us when we come to the Q&A session a little bit later. Okay, so let's get to the basics. Back to the basics now. We're talking about the malnutrition crisis. And do we have a common understanding of what a healthy diet is? There seems to be so much information, and it seems to shift. So, Mark, I'm going to come to you. What is a healthy diet?
I think it's not that complicated. If you look at the research on nutrition science, we sort of have a lot of common ground. We know that it's nutrient dense, that it's sufficient in calories, that it's sufficient in protein, that it has the right quality fats. And I think the problem is that the majority of the calories that are consumed now are extremely refined, high sugar, high flour calories that are often very nutrient poor and that drive a biological mechanism called insulin resistance, where when you consume large amounts, and by the way, the average American consumes about 152 pounds of sugar and about 146 pounds of flour every year, that drives insulin. Insulin drives fat storage around the belly. Fat storage around the belly leads to type 2 diabetes and heart disease and cancer. So that type of food clearly is something we need to shift away from and towards more whole foods, more, as you said, sort of foods that can be not necessarily shipped large distances, but are more decentralized in production, and that provide adequate amounts of nutrient-dense foods. So it's more fruits and vegetables, it's more whole grains and beans, it's more nuts and seeds, it's more, animal products that are sustainably raised. So there's good evidence that is a healthy diet. I think, whether you should be a vegan or paleo, there's a whole sort of spectrum, but basically I think everybody agrees that we need more whole, real food.
Lindiwe, if we look at the developing world, in many ways, cultural foods, traditional foods were abandoned. Is there a problem there that we need to address? And if we embrace those foods, would it change the situation for many of our countries?
Thank you. I think the challenge we're facing, I described the situation in Zimbabwe where we brought food from the village into town. Mm-hmm. But with the high cost of energy, thank God it's gone down now, people cannot afford the luxury of going into the villages, into the rural areas to bring those foods. But our own economies have not invested in processing abilities that make those foods easy to use in an urban setting. When we grew up, we had 20% of the people in the urban areas and 80% in rural. The projections for 2050 is that up to 60, even 70% of the population in most of the African countries will be living in urban setting. We have not invested in foods that they will be able to use, the traditional foods, and the energy constraint is a major one because most of the traditional foods require long hours of cooking. They're designed to cook on an open fire. And even in the villages, we no longer have the firewood that we had the luxury to have. So it's really about this transdisciplinary approach I'm talking about, where we need to invest in food processing technologies that will improve the packaging of these foods, make them readily available in town, and make sure they're processed to enhance the nutrients and not destroy the nutrients and go to high sugar, high fat foods, because they have the potential, but not much research has been done. We've neglected them and left them in the village, and we only enjoy them when we visit the village, and that's a challenge.
Yes, we call them orphaned crops. I find, from media perspective, I find that so fascinating and unfortunate, terribly unfortunate. Yeah. Patrick, I come to you now, and looking at the rural and urban situation, people in both these spaces are malnourished, but what are the differences, do you think, between rural and urban, the situation between the malnutrition in these areas?
I'm going to say that increasingly that distinction doesn't matter for malnutrition. The problems that we already know are urban, which relate to an urban refined diet, processed packaged foods, and I'm not getting after the private sector in that sense. There's a lot of good processed packaged foods, is already in a rural setting. And there's new research about to come out from Eastern and Southern Africa that shows that the middle class, middle income households, they're equally in rural areas as in urban, and 60 to 80% of their expenditure on food is in processed packaged foods in the rural areas. Yes. Yeah. It's already happened. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the opportunity costs of time, particularly of women, in processing foods and the energy availability, and are the policy and price incentives available? Are they right for promoting what we would consider the foods necessary for a healthy diet and making them affordable to the very poor? And just a couple of examples of seeing in the remote mountains of Haiti, really remote mountains of Haiti, a small market, just shacks, and seeing a man walk to his farm in the morning and just pick up a couple of processed packaged foods, cookies, essentially, high sugar, high fat, high salt, brightly colored, cheap and cheerful. And I actually ran after him and said, what did you just spend money for? What was that for? What was that all about? And he said, well, that's my breakfast and my lunch. I can't afford to sit and buy firewood, wait for millet or rice to cook, plus the other ingredients. I just don't have time. And so it's just simply, this will fill me up, it's cheap, this will be my food. Yeah. This is not a choice. This is the people being forced to make those choices. So it's not just about knowledge and information, although those are crucial. It's also about the accessibility of the right foods in the right places. And that requires us to look very carefully at the incentives. Yeah. What are the incentives that are going to allow poor farmers and rich farmers to grow the right foods, market them, not waste them, and have the right foods in markets where they can be chosen by the poor.
I would imagine there's a huge private sector opportunity there to provide healthy food that will sustain people who are in this position, just don't have the opportunity to sit there and cook their food. And I wonder if there are any private sector players here who can share their thoughts on this. CD, I come to you now, and let's take a look at any patterns or trends. Can we see over the next year any specific patterns around the issue of malnutrition? Can we project what's going to happen?
I'm not sure about the projections, but the reality is that this is a question of capacity and will. We have the capacity to change the situation, to increase nutrition, to increase the dietary diversity, to increase the availability of nutritious foods. We know the solutions. Now the will, can we move the dialogue to sort of equal dollars and real investment in this space? And that's where the challenge comes. That's where conferences and forums like this and the report that came out is really increasing that awareness. But can it lead to real action? But I don't really think that it's a matter of can we do it? It's will we do it? Where are the investments going to come? There's a lot of positive momentum. I think you mentioned multinationals, but also whether it's the NGO community, there's a lot of movement around the issue, and foundations and governments programs are moving in the direction. But we need a sustainable effort. We've been here before, especially on the post-harvest loss, food loss issues. In 1975, Henry Kissinger said, let's reduce by 50% the amount of food that's lost around post-harvest loss. And then things happen, the conversation shifts, and we really are bringing back agriculture and nutrition as one conversation. So I think there's positive momentum.
Okay, so I need to just throw this question in here because I think it is critical to ask. Have the issues of food and perhaps water as well, but we're focusing now on nutritious food, has food been politicized, and is that part of the problem that we face? Maybe, Mark, I'll come with you, come around to everyone for a quick feedback on this question.
I think it's a hugely political issue. There's so many competing interests, there's so many misaligned incentives, and I think we haven't really sort of tackled as a global community the intersection of hunger, obesity, agriculture, sustainability in a real conversation where all the stakeholders are having the same conversation, trying to solve for the same problem. Nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to create a system where people are getting chronic disease and obesity, where we can't really solve for these problems. And it's in large part, I think it's economic. If you look at the real cost of food, I think we're not doing an accounting that's actually measuring the true cost of food. So what's the true cost of a soda, for example, and what it's costing us in terms of nature's capital and how we grow the food, affects our aquifers, affects our waterways, our estuaries, and how it affects our soil, how it affects utilization of oil and resources, and on the other side, how it affects human health and human capital by increasing diabetes and obesity. And so we haven't actually calculated the real cost of food into those foods. That's why some guy in Haiti can buy a bunch of cookies for $1. What's the real cost of that? In this country, Secretary Glin and I were talking earlier, we spend $4 billion a year through the SNAP program, food stamps, to buy sodas for the poor. That's 20 million servings a day of soda. And then in the back end, we're paying through Medicare and Medicaid, which is bankrupting us for chronic disease treatment for diabetes. So we have to grapple with those questions, and they're not easy questions, and there's a lot of conflicting needs.
I'm jumping in because I see everyone wants to come in here, and we still have the Q&A. Lindiwe, I'll be with you in a moment, but first, Patrick was aggressively nodding his head during that. So Patrick, over to you.
I think of all countries in the world, where it is highly politicized is the US, and particularly in the context of the upcoming dietary guidelines, for example. The current scientific report, 600 plus pages, is now out for public comment. And these dietary guidelines have often been criticized for being based on the science, but really ignoring issues of cost and sustainability of the agricultural systems. This year, that changes. There is an emphasis, a great emphasis, highly politically contentious, on sustainability of food systems to support nutrition as it should be, as we should see it.
Thank you. Lindiwe.
Definitely, food is heavily politicized, and that's why we talk about food security. It is a big security issue, because we realize that if people are hungry, the governments are unstable, and we cannot go into what's happened in the last 3-4 years in terms of the Arab Spring. Part of that was the fight for natural resources, fight for food, fight for jobs, and all those are pathways that can bring to bear for nutrition and for healthy people. And the challenge here is, what we've seen in Africa is in governments where the head of state has taken full command of the agricultural sector, has commanded the Minister of Finance to put at least 10% of the national budgets into agriculture, resulting in growth of the sector. We've seen the rewards. We've got leading countries now. Rwanda is leading now. In West Africa, we've got examples. We've got Nigeria, which has also been on the map, and Ethiopia, which is doing wonderful things. And all that means that political leaders are aware that feed the people, then you have security. Now, what's the global threat? It is a threat to security worldwide, because people who cannot get food, people who cannot get income, people who cannot get jobs will migrate to places where they can get these services. That destabilizes the world economy. What then is the benefit of feeding those countries or providing job opportunities, food for trade? Is that you then stabilize those countries, you get healthy people, and then you're able to do business. And I think if we're interested in world security, it should start with women, it should start with the womb, it would start with the first 1,000 days, because the future we can redress now. by making sure women are getting into pregnancy healthy, they are giving birth to healthy children, and if we can just capture that window of 1,000 days, then we're up to win. But that's where we've dropped the ball.
Okay, lots of efforts on maternal health care. That's a good news, I think, but it needs to be, the game needs to be upped, basically. CD.
So, Julie, just really quickly, around, and Lindiwe, it was a great comment and point around it being political and it being about food security. But then there's the question of life and death, food safety. The reality is that the contaminants, the disease, the toxins in food are killing people. 30% of all deaths, cancer, liver cancer, kidney cancer, as was mentioned, stunting. So this is a political issue, it's a food security issue, and the food safety issue. And the reality is we have the solutions. Hermetic storage solutions, drying technologies, distribution channels. These are not hard problems to solve. It's a matter of capability and will. And sometimes, as you mentioned, political will.
Yep.
Thank you all for that. I think in a few minutes, Lisa will be taking your questions, so please stand by for that. You'll see her stand up when she's ready to do it. But first, let's talk about climate change. And the Chicago Council's report includes a special focus on the issue of climate change and how it affects malnutrition. So my question to you, what is going on in your spaces? What are you noticing and what must we do to improve the situation? Lindiwe, I see you nodding. Yeah.
I think the sector, to me, that is most affected by agriculture, by climate change is agriculture, particularly in Africa. You're talking of a sector which is depending on rainfall. We've only got 4% coverage in terms of irrigation. So what it means is with the changing climate, temperatures going up, rainfall becoming erratic and unpredictable, farmers are going to the field to harvest nothing. What does that mean when they've put in their money to get nothing? And it's going to get worse because predictions are that we would need at least by 2030, there will be at least 15 to 17% decline in the yields of major cereals. So already there's a scare out there. And Africa is already not producing to potential. The seed industry is not doing well because we're lacking the insurance, the resilience that the farmers need to bounce back after recurrent droughts. Every time they're hit by a drought, they come back poorer. Mm-hmm. And we have not built the resilient systems into ensuring African agriculture so that farmers who lose their seed can go back to the market, buy seed and replant. Mm-hmm. So with these recurrent droughts, with the water shortage and the projected declines in harvest, we are in for disaster. What does that mean then for nutrition security? What does it mean for just hunger? The 800 million people who go to bed hungry today, what does it mean for 2030? So we need to be investing for the future by climate proofing our agriculture. And that talks to adaptation, making sure we've got the right seeds, drought-tolerant seeds, and I'm happy that the consultative group of International Agricultural Research System is investing in water-efficient maize varieties are being released by some of the centers for a variety of crops. ILRI is doing a lot on livestock to make sure that we can climate-proof our agriculture production systems. But also on mitigation, we cannot continue polluting. All of us have the responsibility to cut down on our carbon. So we are in trouble if we do not become climate-smart agriculturalists.
CD, I see you nodding your head there. What's your input on this?
No, I think Lindiwe hit it on the head. I mean, the improvement in seed varieties, water-resistant, drought-tolerant, but also the reality is that smallholder farmers in Africa, the conversation around climate change is a conversation around agriculture. And that needs to be one conversation. And the reality is looking at index-based weather insurance, the ability to sort of transfer your risk. If your livelihood is agriculture and it's dependent on rain-fed agriculture, depending on rain-fed, then you need at some point to be able to transfer some of that risk. And that's where the private sector does come in. There's been a lot of innovations, groups like Swiss Re, reinsurance organizations really looking at Syngenta Foundation, looking at index-based weather insurance, because at the rate of irrigation at 4%, yes, there are a number of irrigation schemes from a national level in the own country that we live in, in Kenya, but also drip irrigation. There are a lot of technologies that are coming out, and how do we scale these? How do we put more of them under utilization? But it is a conversation. Climate change is a conversation about agriculture in the African context.
Patrick?
What I fear, the economist Thomas Piketty triggered a lot of discussion around income inequality. There's been discussion about health inequalities for many years. What we don't hear much about is nutrition inequalities. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about the absolute numbers and the bringing down the average prevalence rates of stunting or whatever metric we're using. What I fear in climate change is that we're going to see increased inequality around nutrition, where the poorest, those who are most malnourished, become increasingly a large share of the total problem, and those at the other end benefiting from processing and cleaner food access, let's say. So it's not just bringing down average rates of the problem. We need to look at the range, the distribution around the average, and understand that an average rate of stunting, let's say, of children of 30% has a range which may go from 10 to 50%. It's those 50% within a single country that worry me most about climate change, because I think the impacts will be distinguished in that kind of way.
In a report released, Kenya Statistics data released just last week, I was shocked to see 25% of children across the country have stunted growth, and you know, it's just alarming.
It's worse. It's worse in Africa. I mean, I was talking about the growth in Nigeria, and yet if you focus on Nigeria in terms of stunting, in 2003 they had 38% of the children were stunted. 10 years later, 2013, 37%. So no change at all, and yet we're booming agriculture-wise. So there's something we're not doing right in matching our agriculture growth with nutrition security.
It's a shame, and it's painful to acknowledge. Mark, let me come to you on this. What happens when a nation is growing, 20, 30%, 40% perhaps, a generation with stunted growth? What does that mean for us?
I mean, we're seeing it, obviously in the developed world. We're seeing it even in this country, where we're seeing a huge achievement gap in children because of food insecurity, malnutrition, obesity. And most kids who are obese actually are iron deficient, zinc deficient, vitamin C deficient, vitamin D deficient, and they have been shown to have poor outcomes in school performance, academically, socially, in terms of their earning capacity, in terms of learning disabilities. And we're now, I think, 25th in reading and 29th in math in the world, the United States, because of this achievement gap due to our poor nutrition in this country, which is in fact being overfed and undernourished. I think it's different than the problems in the developing world that are around real stunting and not obesity related. But they're kind of similar at the other ends of the spectrum, and they have huge consequences for the capital of our human population and our children's future. What's happening to our children is the most frightening thing to me. I mean, we're seeing this affecting every sector, from national security to global economic competitiveness to, kids' quality of life and their future success.
Wow. But I think what's scary is that you're talking of 30% stunted now of children under 5. Look at 30 years from now. What is the type of generation we're breeding of leaders? Where 1 in 3 have low cognitive capacity? Because I think the challenge in stunting, we always think about height.
Right.
It's here.
Right.
Yeah.
Lisa, we're joined now by Lisa. She's on the podium. She's ready to take your questions. Lisa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have about 20 minutes for audience Q&A. Please wait for the microphone to arrive and state your name and affiliation, and please keep your questions short. The gentleman over here in the second row to the left.
If we believe that a significant part of the solution will come from people on the ground solving their own problems, then we should also recognize that the innovations that big organizations bring to the field are almost never implementable by those individuals. Mm-hmm. So that means we need a massive infusion of innovation designed for people to solve their own problems. Last year, USAID, Sweden, and the Netherlands presented Securing Water for Food. it's amazing that's the first time that a few $1 million was put against finding those kinds of solutions. First time in history, I believe. They got 600 competitors from all over the world. $10 million for scale winners, $5 million for startup winners. At the end of the day, there were 17 winners. There were only 2 scale winners.
That's very incredible.
So the question is, how is it possible we haven't been doing this sooner? What organizations around the world should be doing similar kinds of efforts? Because this is just the tip of the iceberg. And what is it that we're not doing such that some of the winners would be scalable? And what should we be doing so they will be?
So shall we put that, David Wilcox, you didn't introduce yourself, but my 2020 vision, I got your name tag there. So David has made a really important point. So, why have we not done this earlier? Is it that we haven't been aware that this is a model perhaps that we should be using? CD, I'll start with you and come all the way down.
I think, locally driven solutions that are developed on the ground, bottom up. Again, in my experience, from the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Challenge Fund, sort of looking at locally driven innovation is something that, whether it's been done in the past, is questionable. Is it happening now? Yes. I mean, I'm looking out at the audience. I see representatives of GAIN, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, a marketplace for nutritious foods, a call for proposals in communities in Kenya and Tanzania, in Mozambique. Come one, come all for solutions to nutritionally based food solutions. So there are innovations, there are challenge funds, there are things that are happening that are really trying to bring about transformational change at the local level. The foundation, just in terms of resilience building, we recently had a launch with USAID and Swiss CEDA, a global partnership for resilience, where the challenge was in the Horn of Africa, in the Sahel, in Southeast Asia, any locally driven resilience building activities, whether it's to conflict, to drought, to climate, to give people the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of chronic stresses that those regions face. Give us your solutions. And we had 450 applications, chose 17, and now are putting them through a process, and they all may get $1 million for a locally based, locally driven, locally developed solutions to those challenges.
Right. Anyone want to add to that? I think
yes,
okay.
I'd like to add to that. I think, why hasn't it been happening? I think where people are driven by a crisis. The Green Revolution came about because there was a crisis. And we're calling for a new revolution now because we are in a crisis. What are we doing? In my own organization as FANRPAN, we're working in 5 countries starting from last year, where we're going to existing agriculture projects, thanks to support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and asking the critical question, how was this agriculture project designed? If you're doing it for income, we've got cocoa farmers in West Africa. What can we bring within the existing project to bring a nutrition outcome that's positive? So you're looking at income from cocoa, but there are opportunities, either intercropping, either harvesting, increasing your yields, and using that income with better behaviors to buy nutrition-dense foods, to influence work allocation, labor at household level, to influence the amount of income that women can get control of, because we've got the statistics. You give them more income, you get 20% increase in productivity at household level. So we are already doing, and this is a 6-year project.
Lindiwe, Patrick, so we can take as many questions as possible. Patrick,
just that all markets are segmented, and agriculture is no different. So there's not going to be a single solution or innovation, obviously, that fits everyone. The Gates and DFID-funded Global Panel on Agriculture, Food Systems and Nutrition is explicitly, like Chicago Council, pointing to food systems solutions, which require us to not only look at agriculture, innovation and scaling, but the same in processing, in knowledge, skills development, and supporting consumer demand, which is informed demand, ideally. So governments, private sector, all have different roles in that whole spectrum. But it's not just in agriculture. Innovations are needed throughout, but the scalable things are essentially knowledge and quality of services and choice.
Lisa?
That's terrific. Let's go ahead and take maybe 3 questions, and then we'll have the panel respond to all 3. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Ajay Markanday. I'm the director for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization based here in Washington for North America, which covers the US and Canada. My question largely is looking at the critical pathway or the synergy between science, innovation, research, technology, advocacy, and policy response. And if I can look at an analogy, the way that I see it, it's almost like a dam, where we have a huge volume of advocacy, science, and research, but the dam only allows very small bits of this to trickle down into policy. And as the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, I'd like to give you some examples, because I think they were raised by the panel. The first is, in 2010-11, FAO issued one of its flagship reports was on gender in agriculture, the state of food and agriculture, which very clearly demonstrated the economic merits of investment in gender in agriculture.
Thank you so much, sir. Do you have a question?
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to say, the point that I'm trying to say is, from the panelists, I'm getting quite a lot of, my notion is that there's a lot of supply and we understand the problem, but how do you make it actionable? And political will is too loose a term to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
An excellent point. Thank you. Please, the lady over here in the white, in the fourth row back.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. This question directly relates to a comment that Julie made. You had said something about the opportunity for the private sector to take advantage of this need for healthy foods. And I just want to add one more comment to that, and I think there's a huge opportunity for the private sector to produce healthy, fortified foods. And on a global level, GAIN has worked with staple foods and with governments to get foods fortified. However, the private sector is producing a vast amount of processed foods that could be healthy and fortified, and it's just not happening. So my question actually is a question for you to ask. You asked about how many doctors are here. I would be curious to know how many people work in the private sector in the food business, and can we get more of those players to these kinds of meetings so we can get some action?
And Miss, what is your name and affiliation?
Oh, my name is Nancy Martin, and I run a small advocacy organization called Fortify.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. We'll take one more. We have one of our next generation delegates right here in the third row in the center wearing the blue blazer.
Thank you. My name is Afton Haller, and I'm representing University of Copenhagen. And my question is regarding food culture. And so we have a lot of focus on feeding people, getting food in the mouths of people around the world. But what my concern is that when we focus too much on the feeding, we really reduce the importance of food culture and the traditions surrounding food. And these are extremely important issues that I feel are not recognized in a lot of the programs that we see, a lot of the development assistance that we see around the world. So are there any long-term repercussions of this when we focus only on food as something that sustains you, but not something that is part of your culture? Maybe we see some effects long-term down the road. Perhaps one of you can address that issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Over to the panel.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah. So each of you, because of time, I think you've heard the contributions that have been made. Let me start with you, Patrick, on your end. How do we make solutions available? Is the first. I'll take you through the questions. The first question basically was, how do we make solutions available? And let's be a little bit more specific with how we get this done. The second question from Nancy, really important, perhaps not a question, but can we get more people? We should, and maybe Lisa can comment on that one. And then the final question was basically the importance of food culture and keeping that alive. Patrick.
All great questions. I spend a lot of time maybe 4 trips a year to Nepal, up into the Himalayas, where food culture matters a great deal, but is changing rapidly under the importation of processed foods from China primarily, but also from India. We need to be having these conversations in China and India, where a lot of the private sector processed food production is actually taking place. It's not coming from here and being exported. And I can assure you there are plenty of mothers in the Himalayas who are feeding unfortified pot noodles to their children as complementary foods, post-breastfeeding, simply because of time constraints. You just add water, mix it, that's it. So just calories, no micronutrients, no quality, no culture. So it's changing very rapidly, but it's not in one place that is happening. It's happening all over the world at the same time. It's a very dynamic picture, and we need to engage the private sector across the world in this conversation to be able to address the kinds of concerns that have been raised.
Thank you. Lindiwe?
Thank you. I'll start with the culture one. I thought I brought my grandmother here so that I'll bring the Zulu culture into this room. But if you go back to agriculture, it is agri and culture. And you're right to say, what are we doing about these cultures? Unfortunately, there's some bad cultures. And I come from one area where I talked about grandmom slaughtering a whole chicken for us. And the whole backbone traditionally has to go to the man. Together with the thighs, that's 3 pieces out of 9. What do the women get? The soup, if at all. So the meat does not go to the children, it goes to the men. And only the soup goes to the children. And yet studies have been done that if you just give 60 grams of meat per day to children, their cognitive capacity doubles. What does that mean? It means we have to revisit certain cultures and bring in new knowledge for behavior change. It will take time, but information, knowledge will help us achieve that. Now, on the issue of private sector, my call would be, do we have more private sector that can go into what was called orphan crops? Because they are also called female crops. Because there's been no investment to improve the quality of the seed, the yield is low, and therefore it means they can only feed their families with these products for only about 30 days in a year. And yet if we put the amount of investments we've put into commodity crops, like the big staples, I'm sure we would up our nutrition gain. So more investment into improving the productivity of orphan crops, of female crops, and maybe destigmatizing and changing the name into commodity crops of these staples, because they are staples, but we've tended to make the staples the commodity ones.
Thank you.
And more investment in livestock products, because that can be done. The goats, the chickens, the small ruminants are critical, and the eggs for the family.
Thank you, Lindiwe. Mark, let me come to you, and perhaps specifically that question of the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think food fortification clearly has been a huge advance. Folic acid and neural tube defects and vitamin D in foods and rickets. I mean, clearly we've moved a lot of previously prevalent diseases off the table because of that. But I think it's concerning to me to hear a solution of adding nutrients to poor quality food. It doesn't make it good food. In other words, if the food is high glycemic by nature and raises blood sugar quickly, will drive insulin resistance and diabetes, even if it has a lot of vitamins and minerals. The other issue is we don't actually know what we're taking out. In other words, we know a few things to put in, but God and nature, whatever you believe in, is much smarter than we are. And there's all sorts of phytochemicals and informational products in food that is provided by nature when you have complex, rich plant foods that are not being consumed by most of the population of the world anymore. And I think we have to figure out how to redesign and rethink the way we process food so that it actually retains more of its original qualities, and we don't refine those out. And that will ultimately lead to much healthier populations.
CD, your responses, and I specifically want you to address the question that was raised, I think it was by Arjun from the Food and Agriculture Organization, on solutions, actionable solutions.
The key for actionable solutions to me are integrated interventions, where we're talking about integrating market demand with smallholder farmer-driven supply that puts in technology, not technology from a silver bullet perspective, but technology integrated into a system. So hermetic storage solutions that are linked with buyers and producers of grains, that looking at cold storage solutions that are linked with the realities around, is there a market for what we're preserving? So the solutions to me have to be integrated, that we're looking at market demand, smallholder farmer-driven supply, technology, and affordability, access to finance. And so the key for me is sort of looking at this from a systemic standpoint and not silver bullets. And the last piece, when I think about culture and I think about food, to me it goes to the reality is the richest people on the planet, whether they're in Luxembourg or the poorest people on the planet, whether in Turkana, Kenya, tell their kids, tell their families the same thing about food. They tell their children, eat all your food, don't waste food. And so that to me is the culture. The culture is a culture of not wasting.
Thank you so much. We have about 3 minutes left, so let's take, in closing, 2 questions from Twitter. First, Susanna Faulkner wants to know, and I think, CD, this is specifically for you, but would welcome comments from others, how the U.S. government can lead on reducing food waste, both here and abroad. And the second question is for you, Lindiwe, from Catherine Bertini, and she would like to know what did change between your grandmother's time and now to have your cousins so much in need.
So, two quick responses. In terms of food waste and from a behavior change communication standpoint, it really is greater awareness, bringing about greater awareness. And it's linking to some global initiatives that are happening with UNEP around Think, Eat, Save, some global initiatives that really are talking about save food. So it's linking to globally existing initiatives that are ongoing, but also continuing the investment that's happening under USAID and Feed the Future with an emphasis on post-harvest loss. Again, because to me, this is a gateway solution. If you look at reducing post-harvest loss, income improvements, food and nutritional security, environmental sustainability. And so just continuing and advancing some of the efforts, and then joining initiatives that the Rockefeller Foundation and others are. So more coordination, partnerships, and collaboration.
Mm-hmm. What changed between the 60s and 2015 is that as a result of the improved markets for maize, for corn, the cousins decided to go all corn on the full 1 acre plot and nothing else. Now, mined the soil, continued using the same amount of fertilizer, which is just 1 bag, because that's what they've always known, and yet 40 years you are mining the soil of all the nutrients and just planting the same crop throughout the year. The result is you're using poor quality seed, you're using minimum, not prescribed fertilizer rates, and the rainfall has changed, the patterns have changed, and yet without fail, in my village, they still go to plant November 11. I don't know what's special about that date, but November 11 is the planting date for most of Zimbabwe. You don't do that, you don't get good rain. So we need to improve education. We need to look at better technologies, but most of it is not affordable because the markets are failing the people. So if we had good markets for the orphan crops, I'm sure they would have stayed in that business. But they were called grandmom's crops, and they didn't need to be planted because corn had a better price. So I think it's the market economy, it's the whole food systems. We have not fed the soil, we've not fed the pockets of the farmers, and we've not fed the national economy. And we always say farming is about feed the soil, feed the fiscus, feed the pockets, and then you have healthy people. But the puzzle has failed.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Please join me in thanking the first panel.